Hey, old man, this isn't a nursing home. The gym owner's voice cut through the weight room like a drill sergeant's bark. Robert Hayes looked up from the bench press, confused. He'd been quietly warming up with just the bar, bothering no one. You're making the real athletes uncomfortable, the owner continued. Find somewhere else to pretend you're still strong. But what he didn't know was that this weak old man was a decorated Marine Force Recon veteran, and his unit never left anyone behind. The Iron Forge gym sat on the edge of Sacramento's downtown district, a converted warehouse that catered to serious lifters and fitness enthusiasts who prided themselves on their dedication to physical excellence. Chrome machines gleamed under harsh fluorescent lights. Mirrors covered every wall, and the air hung thick with the scent of chalk, sweat, and protein powder. It was the kind of place where muscle mass mattered more than character, where your worth was measured by the plates you could stack on a bar. At 73, Robert Bulldog Hayes moved through this temple of youth and strength like a shadow from another era. His weathered Marine Corps cap sat low over eyes that had seen too much, and his simple gym bag contained nothing more than a water bottle, a towel, and the hope that movement might ease the constant ache in his bones. He paid his monthly membership fee in cash, arrived early when the gym was less crowded, and kept to himself. The gym's owner, 32-year-old Derek Morrison, had built Iron Forge into Sacramento's premier fitness destination through a combination of aggressive marketing, social media presence, and an atmosphere that the young, the strong, and the photogenic. Derek himself was a specimen, 6'2", 240 pounds of carefully sculpted muscle, with a spray tan that never faded and a confidence that bordered on arrogance. He'd never served in the military, never faced anything more dangerous than a failed business venture, but he carried himself with the swagger of someone who believed physical strength was the ultimate measure of a man's worth. Robert had been coming to Iron Forge for 3 months, ever since his VA doctor recommended resistance training to help with the chronic pain that had plagued him since Vietnam. The shrapnel still lodged near his spine made certain movements difficult, and old nerve damage in his hands caused them to tremble when he was tired. But he persisted, working with weights that would have seemed laughable to the younger members, focusing on mobility and function rather than maximum lifts. He'd served with the First Force Reconnaissance Company from 1968 to 1971, conducting deep penetration patrols behind enemy lines in Vietnam. Force Recon Marines were the elite of the elite, tasked with gathering intelligence and conducting raids in territories where no other American forces dared to venture. They moved in small teams, lived off the land for weeks at a time, and operated under the constant threat of death or capture. Robert had earned 2 Purple Hearts, a Silver Star, and the quiet respect of men who understood what it meant to stare death in the face and never blink. But none of that history was visible to the young men who populated Iron Forge. They saw only an old man who struggled with weights they considered warm-ups, whose hands shook when he tried to grip the bar, who moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose body had betrayed him. They didn't see the discipline that got him to the gym at 6 a.m. every Tuesday and Thursday. They didn't see the determination it took to push through pain that would have sent most men to bed. They certainly didn't see the invisible scars that marked him as one of America's forgotten warriors. On this particular Thursday morning, Robert was working through his routine on the bench press. He'd loaded just the 45-pound bar, no additional plates, and was focusing on form rather than weight. His movements were slow and controlled, each repetition a careful negotiation between his will and his body's limitation. He'd completed 2 sets and was resting between exercises when Derek Morrison approached. "Excuse me," Derek said, his voice loud enough to draw attention from nearby lifters. "You've been hogging that bench for 20 minutes. Robert looked up, surprised. "I can move if someone needs it," he said quietly. "I was just resting between sets." Derek's eyes swept over the empty bar, taking in the lack of weight plates with obvious disdain. "Sets of what? Airlifting? Look, Pops, this is a serious gym for serious athletes. Maybe you'd be more comfortable at one of those senior centers with the foam weights." A few nearby lifters chuckled, and Robert felt his face flush with embarrassment. He'd faced enemy fire without flinching, but this public humiliation cut deeper than any wound he'd received in combat. "I pay my membership," Robert said, his voice steady despite the anger building in his chest. "Same as everyone else." Yeah. Well, maybe it's time to reconsider that arrangement, Derek replied, crossing his arms to display his impressive biceps. This isn't a charity case, Jim. When real lifters see you struggling with an empty bar, it ruins the atmosphere. It makes us look like a place where anyone can just come in and play pretend. The comment stung because Robert knew there was truth in it. He was struggling, his body was failing him, and every day was a battle against the limitations that age and war had imposed on him. But the suggestion that his efforts were somehow less worthy, that his pain was an inconvenience to others, ignited something that had been dormant for years. "I'm not pretending anything," Robert said, standing slowly. At 6 feet tall, he'd once been an imposing figure, but years and injury had stooped his shoulders and thinned his frame. Still, something in his bearing, the way he held himself, the directness of his gaze, suggested reserves of strength that weren't immediately apparent. Derek either didn't notice or didn't care. "Look, I'm trying to be nice here. There are plenty of Planet Fitness locations where you'd fit right in. This is Iron Forge. We're about serious training, serious results. You're making my other members uncomfortable." "I'm making them uncomfortable?" Robert asked, glancing around at the handful of lifters who were now openly watching the confrontation. "By quietly working out and minding my own business, by being a liability," Derek shot back. "What happens when you hurt yourself with those shaking hands? When you can't handle the weight and drop it on someone? I can't have that kind of risk in my gym." The words hit Robert like physical blows. His hands did shake, nerve damage from carrying wounded Marines through rice paddies while under fire. His movements were careful and measured, because shrapnel near his spine could cause excruciating pain if he moved wrong. Every limitation Derek was mocking was a souvenir of service to his country. "You know what?" Derek continued, emboldened by the lack of resistance. "I think it's time you found somewhere else to work out. I'm refunding your membership. Consider it a favor. I'm saving you from embarrassing yourself further." The gym had gone quiet now, all pretense of working out abandoned as members watched the confrontation unfold. Some looked uncomfortable, others seemed to enjoy the spectacle, but none spoke up in Robert's defense. Robert nodded slowly, his jaw tight with controlled anger. He'd learned long ago when to fight and when to withdraw, and this wasn't a battle worth fighting. Not here, not like this. He gathered his simple gym bag, placed his water bottle inside with deliberate care, and walked toward the exit without another word. As he reached the door, Derek called after him, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "Nothing personal, Pops. Just business. Maybe try bowling instead. Less chance of getting hurt." A few members laughed, and Robert paused with his hand on the door handle. For a moment, it looked like he might turn around, might say something that would wipe the smug expression off Derek's face. Instead, he pushed through the door and walked into the Sacramento morning, leaving behind the sound of Derek's triumphant chuckling. What Derek Morrison didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Robert Hayes maintained contact with his old Force Recon unit. In an age of social media and instant communication, the bonds forged in Vietnamese jungles had only grown stronger. The monthly barbecues, the annual reunions, the network of brotherhood that stretched across the country. It was more than nostalgia. It was family. Sitting in his truck in the gym's parking lot, Robert pulled out his phone and opened the group text that connected him to 11 other aging warriors scattered across the country. His fingers, steady now despite Derek's cruel comments about their trembling, typed a simple message: "Disrespected at Iron Forge Gym, Sacramento. Owner Derek Morrison. Not looking for sympathy, just venting to family." He hit send and started his truck, unaware that his message had just activated a network of loyalty that spanned 5 decades and would converge on Sacramento within hours. Because Force Recon Marines had a saying, "No man left behind." And that promise didn't have an expiration date. The responses came within minutes. Robert was halfway home when his phone started buzzing with incoming messages. He pulled over to read them, and despite his earlier humiliation, found himself smiling for the first time all day. "On my way. ETA 4 hours. Ghost. Flying in from Phoenix. See you at 1400. Iron Man. Already in California. Will be there." Snake. One by one, his old teammates checked in. Men in their 70s, scattered across the country, dropping everything to respond to a brother's call for support. They didn't ask for details, didn't question whether it was necessary. The message was enough. By noon, cars with license plates from Nevada, Arizona, Oregon, and Texas began arriving at a small diner 3 blocks from Iron Forge Gym. The men who emerged moved with the careful deliberation of age, but their bearing still carried echoes of the elite warriors they'd once been. Some walked with canes, others moved stiffly from old injuries, but when they gathered around a corner table at Mickey's Diner, time seemed to fold in on itself. Robert arrived to find them waiting, these 11 men who'd shared foxholes and fear, who'd bled together in jungles most Americans couldn't find on a map. Ghost, James Patterson from Nevada, had arrived first, his motorcycle parked prominently outside. Iron Man, Michael Chen from Phoenix, sat beside Snake, David Rodriguez from Oregon. One by one, Robert embraced men he hadn't seen in months, some in years, but who felt like extensions of his own soul. "So," Ghost said without preamble, his voice still carrying the quiet authority that had made him their point man all those years ago, "tell us about this gym owner." Robert recounted the morning's events, describing Derek's attitude, his cruel comments about shaking hands and pretending to be strong. The men listened in silence, their faces growing harder with each detail. "Shaking hands," Snake muttered, flexing fingers that bore their own scars from combat. "Mine shake too when I'm tired. Nerve damage from that firefight outside Da Nang." "Pretending to be strong," Iron Man added, his voice tight with anger. "You carried me 3 miles with a bullet in your leg, Bulldog. If that's pretending, I'll take pretense over what passes for strength these days." The plan was simple, too simple to even call a plan. They would visit Iron Forge Gym as a group, not to threaten or intimidate, but to educate, to show Derek Morrison and his members what real strength looked like when it was multiplied by brotherhood and tempered by decades of shared sacrifice. At exactly 2 p.m., 12 men walked through the doors of Iron Forge Gym. They moved in loose formation, Ghost taking point as he had 50 years earlier, the others spreading out to cover the room. They weren't armed with anything more dangerous than Medicare cards and old stories, but something about their presence made the gym go quiet. Derek Morrison was at the front desk, reviewing membership contracts, when he looked up to see them approaching. 12 old men, most wearing some piece of military memorabilia, a unit patch, a unit cap, dog tags visible beneath open shirts. They moved with purpose despite their age, and something about their collective bearing made Derek's confident smile falter. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" Derek asked, trying to maintain his usual aggressive sales pitch tone. "Looking for a tour of the facility." Ghost stepped forward, his weathered face impassive. "We're here about Robert Hayes." Derek's expression hardened. "The old guy from this morning? Look, I explained to him that this isn't the right fit. Nothing personal, just—" "Robert Hayes," Ghost interrupted, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who'd once directed artillery strikes through enemy fire, "is a decorated Marine Force Reconnaissance veteran. 2 Purple Hearts, Silver Star, 3 tours in Vietnam." The gym had gone silent now, members stopping mid-rep to listen to the exchange. Derek glanced around nervously before forcing a laugh. "Look, I respect veterans and all, but this is a business. I can't have people getting hurt because they can't handle the equipment." "Can't handle the equipment?" Snake stepped forward, his voice deceptively calm. "Bulldog carried a 200-pound wounded Marine through 10 miles of jungle with enemy forces tracking us. He's handled equipment that would give you nightmares." Derek's face flushed. "I don't care what he did 50 years ago. This is now, and now he's a liability." The words hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield. Around the gym, members had stopped pretending to work out and were openly staring at the confrontation. Some had their phones out, recording what was clearly becoming something more than a simple customer service dispute. Iron Man pulled out a folded photograph from his wallet, 12 young Marines in jungle fatigues, weapons at the ready. Robert Hayes clearly visible in the center. "This was taken in 1970, outside Khe Sanh. We just completed a 72-hour reconnaissance mission behind enemy lines. No sleep, no hot food, no support except what we carried." He placed the photo on Derek's desk with gentle precision. The man you humiliated this morning crawled through tunnels filled with enemy soldiers to gather intelligence that saved American lives. His hands shake because he carried wounded Marines to safety while under fire. His movements are careful because he has shrapnel near his spine from an enemy grenade. Another veteran, Tommy Doc Sullivan, stepped forward. As the unit's medic, he treated Robert's wounds in the field. Every limitation you mocked is a result of service to this country, and you turned that service into a punchline. Derek looked around the gym, clearly hoping for support from his members, but found only uncomfortable stares and disappointed expressions. A young man who'd been loading plates onto a squat bar approached the group. "Excuse me," he said quietly. "I'm active duty Army, deployed twice to Afghanistan." He looked directly at Derek. "These men are why I was able to serve. They paved the way, paid the price. What you did this morning," he shook his head, "that's not who we are as Americans." One by one, other gym members began to speak up. A woman who'd been using the elliptical machine approached with tears in her eyes. "My grandfather was killed in Vietnam," she said, her voice breaking. "He never came home. This man did, and you treated him like garbage for having the courage to keep trying, to keep fighting even when his body is failing him." Derek's confident facade was crumbling. "Look, I didn't know. You didn't want to know," Ghost interrupted. "You saw an old man struggling and decided he was worthless. You never asked about his story, never considered that his limitations might be the result of sacrifice. The confrontation might have continued indefinitely, but it was interrupted by a new arrival. Through the gym's front door walked Robert Hayes, drawn by a phone call from Ghost informing him that his brothers had gathered. He moved slowly, deliberately, his gym bag in one hand and his pride intact, despite the morning's humiliation. The 12 Force Recon veterans formed a loose circle around their brother, a formation they'd used countless times in Vietnamese jungles when protecting wounded comrades. Derek Morrison found himself facing not just one old man he could intimidate, but 13 warriors whose bond transcended age, injury, and time. "Robert," Ghost said without taking his eyes off Derek, "this young man has something to say to you." Derek Morrison stood frozen behind his desk, the weight of 13 sets of eyes bearing down on him. The photograph of young Marines lay on his desk like evidence in a court-martial, and around him, his own gym members watched with expressions ranging from disgust to outright hostility toward their own gym owner. Derek started, then stopped. The words he'd used so easily that morning, liability, pretending, nursing home, seemed impossibly cruel in the face of what he'd just learned. Robert Hayes stepped forward, his weathered face calm but his eyes holding the same steel that had carried him through 3 tours in Vietnam. "I don't need an apology," he said quietly. "I've been disrespected by better men than you." The simple dignity of the statement hit Derek harder than any insult could have. Around him, his gym members shifted uncomfortably, and he realized that his business, his livelihood, hung in the balance of what he said next. "Mr. Hayes," Derek said, his voice smaller than it had been all day, "I was wrong. I made assumptions based on what I could see, and I failed to recognize the strength that brought you here in the first place." He looked around at the Force Recon veterans, then back at Robert. "Your membership is reinstated permanently, with no charge, and if you'll accept it, I'd like to designate Tuesday and Thursday mornings as veterans' hours, reserve time for any veteran who wants to work out without judgment or pressure." The offer was more than Robert had expected, but Ghost wasn't finished. "That's a start," he said, "but respect isn't just about policy changes, it's about understanding." Over the next hour, in a scene that would be talked about in Sacramento for years to come, 12 Force Recon veterans transformed Iron Forge Gym into an impromptu classroom. They shared stories not of glory, but of sacrifice. They described the weight of carrying wounded comrades, the long-term effects of combat stress, the challenges faced by aging warriors whose bodies had been broken in service to their country. Derek Morrison, the man who'd built his identity around physical strength, learned about a different kind of power, the strength to endure, to sacrifice, to carry on when your body begged you to quit. He learned that the trembling hands he'd mocked had once steadied wounded Marines in helicopter landing zones under enemy fire. The careful movements he'd ridiculed were the result of a spine that had absorbed shrapnel meant for a younger Marine. By the time the veterans prepared to leave, Iron Forge Gym had been transformed. Members who'd never given a thought to military service approached the Force Recon veterans with genuine respect and gratitude. Young bodybuilders who'd measured their worth in bench press numbers found themselves humbled by stories of men who'd lifted the weight of war itself. Derek himself was a changed man. The arrogance that had defined his interaction with Robert that morning had been replaced by something approaching wisdom. As the veterans prepared to leave, he pulled Robert aside. "I want to learn," Derek said simply, "about what you've been through, about what other veterans deal with. I want to make this place worthy of men like you." Robert studied the younger man's face, seeing genuine remorse where hours earlier there had been only contempt. "Strength isn't about what you can lift," he said finally. "It's about what you can carry. And sometimes the heaviest weights are invisible." 6 months later, Iron Forge Gym had become something unique in Sacramento, a fitness center that measured success not just in pounds lifted, but in lives changed. The Veterans Hours program had expanded to include not just workout time but support groups, job placement assistance, and peer counseling. Derek Morrison, his perspective permanently altered by his encounter with the Force Recon veterans, had become an advocate for veterans' issues throughout the community. Robert Hayes continued his Tuesday and Thursday routine, but now he wasn't alone. Other veterans, drawn by word of mouth and the gym's new reputation, joined him. Some were young, recently returned from Iraq and Afghanistan. Others were Korea and Vietnam veterans who'd given up on physical fitness until they found a place where their limitations were understood rather than mocked. The photograph of 12 young Marines still sat in a frame on Derek's desk, but it had been joined by others. Pictures from Veterans Day events, group photos from the gym's monthly veteran barbecues, and images of older warriors mentoring younger ones in the pursuit of strength that transcended muscle mass. One particular photo captured the transformation perfectly. Robert Hayes, seated on a bench press, surrounded by Force Recon veterans and new veteran members of the gym. His hands were visible in the shot, trembling slightly, as they always did when he was tired, but steady on the barbell he was lifting. The weight on the bar was modest, still just the 45-pound bar and a pair of small plates, but his form was perfect, his expression focused, and the support surrounding him was immeasurable. Beneath the photo, Derek had placed a small plaque with a quote that had become the gym's unofficial motto: "Real strength isn't measured by what you can lift, but by what you refuse to put down." The transformation hadn't happened overnight, and it hadn't been easy. Some members had left uncomfortable with the new atmosphere of respect and inclusion, but they'd been replaced by others, veterans, active military, and civilians who were drawn to a fitness center that valued character as much as physical capability. Robert Hayes never spoke publicly about that morning when he'd been humiliated and ejected from the gym. He didn't need to. His continued presence, his quiet determination, and the brotherhood that surrounded him spoke louder than any words could. Every Tuesday and Thursday he proved that strength comes in many forms, and that the most powerful force in the world isn't muscle or aggression. It's the unbreakable bond between warriors who refuse to leave anyone behind. Derek Morrison had learned the hardest lesson of his life that day, that true strength isn't about dominating others, but about lifting them up. And in a world that often measures worth by youth, power, and physical perfection, Iron Forge Gym had become something rarer, a place where the invisible scars of service were honored, where limitations born of sacrifice were respected, and where an old Marine's trembling hands were seen not as weakness, but as testament to strength that younger men could only hope to achieve. The story of Robert Hayes and the Force Recon veterans became a reminder that heroism doesn't end when the uniform comes off, and that the strongest people are often those who've been broken and rebuilt by experiences that would destroy others. In a culture obsessed with youth and perfection, they'd created a space where age was honored, scars were respected, and every rep was a victory against time, injury, and the weight of memory. Because real warriors never stop fighting, they just learn to carry different weight.